All right, so today we're diving into something really interesting. It's a critique of the modern left, but what's so fascinating is where it's coming from. We're talking about a lifelong leftist who, believe it or not, now feels, well, politically homeless. So, to really get where she's coming from, you have to understand her background. I mean, this isn't someone who just dabbled. She's always voted Labour, and sometimes even the Green Party in the UK. And that's what makes this whole thing so wild, right? How does a dedicated leftist get to a point where she actually feels more comfortable talking politics with a conservative? Let's unpack that. Okay, first things first. Let's look at the bedrock of her argument. It all starts with her economic views, which she herself calls center-left. And yeah, when you look at her policy positions, that totally checks out. She's all for things like universal health care, making university tuition cheaper. She believes in a social market economy, welfare capitalism. And she's even on board with ideas like universal basic income to fight poverty. I mean, these are pretty classic progressive stances.
But here's where the story takes a turn. This is really the heart of the conflict. While her economic beliefs are solidly on the left, her actual day-to-day social experiences, they tell a totally different story.
And that brings us to her critique of what she calls woke politics. Now, that's a loaded term, for sure, but it's the one she uses to describe this pattern of behavior she's seen in left-wing circles that just completely turned her off. So she talks about her experiences, living in London, going to left-leaning schools, and she lays out these key behaviors. She says that in her experience, a lot of people on the left treat any kind of disagreement as a personal attack. They'll literally end friendships over having the wrong opinion. And their views aren't just ideas up for debate. They're treated as absolute moral truths. To really get to the bottom of this, she actually came up with her own term for it: toxic empathy. And what she means by that is a situation where sounding compassionate becomes way more important than actually being reasonable or honest. So from her perspective, it creates this kind of performance of caring. And the result, it just completely shuts down any real, honest conversation that might, challenge the main story. So all of these experiences led her somewhere she never expected to be. She started noticing this massive difference in how disagreements were handled, comparing the left to her conversations with centrists and even conservatives. She basically saw this huge split. With the left, she felt it was all about personal attacks and getting shut out if you disagreed. But on the flip side, she found that people on the right were more open to just debating, to having a real conversation, even if they were miles apart on an issue. And this all leads to a pretty jaw-dropping statement. I mean, remember, this is a lifelong Labour voter. But she says that at this point, she honestly feels more comfortable talking to someone who votes for a party like Reform UK, which is, a right-wing populist party. But her critique doesn't just stop with how people talk to each other. She takes it a step further, pointing out what she sees as a major inconsistency when it comes to the left's whole approach to free speech. Basically, she's arguing that there's a huge double standard for how harmful speech is treated, especially online. And she says it creates this really uneven playing field for what people are allowed to say. Here's how she sees it. The extreme right gets, in her words, heavily suppressed. But she claims the extreme left, they get a pass to say pretty much anything. And here's the kicker. She says that while the left is always talking about limiting speech that causes harm, they don't seem to recognize that some of their own ideas can also cause harm. But if you try to criticize those ideas, nope, that's treated as totally unacceptable. And finally, we get to what she sees as this fundamental change in what the left-wing movement is even about anymore, its identity and its focus. She kind of maps out this big transformation. Back in the day, the left was the party of the working class. That was its whole identity. But now, she says it's mostly dominated by these affluent middle-class activists who have a totally different set of priorities. And you can really feel her frustration here. She just wishes the whole movement would get back to focusing on the big, serious stuff, mental health, the NHS, housing, unemployment, instead of what she calls an obsession over pronouns and virtue signaling. So after all this, where does that leave her? Well, feeling totally alienated from her political home, she's actually found a new one. She's realigned herself with the Social Democratic Party. And why them? Well, it ties right back into that core conflict we've been talking about. In her eyes, the SDP is the party for people just like her, people who are economically on the left but are just completely fed up with all the modern woke politics. Now look, this whole analysis is obviously coming from her own personal experience, and so we want to leave you with the same question she asks. What is your experience with people on the left? It's a really good prompt to think about our own political conversations and, where we all fit into this picture.